How's it going, my style friends? My name is Gary, and this is my channel, Weakest of Weeks. If you're a first-time viewer, I appreciate you clicking on the video, and definitely consider subscribing if you love how-to stuff, and especially Saab-related things. So, as you may have seen on the part 1 of the front-end rebuild series of my daily driver here, my 2008 Saab 93 Aero, on the last episode, we tore it apart. We removed the caliper, the brake rotors, pads, sway bar end link, which fought me tooth and nail, the strut assembly, and remove the faulty wheel bearing, which led to this giant ordeal. So off camera, I cleaned things up. Today's video, part 2, we will be finally reassembling everything. Woo-wee, would you look at that? Just look at that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Here's where we left off last, removal of all these faulty components. Now this strut assembly, like mentioned in the previous episode, is a Stag aftermarket brand with lowering coil springs. Not the most ideal thing ever, not the best quality, but it will do for now. I'll show you how to replace just that top strut mount. Here's the original control arm. The rubber, they are both in decent shape. Ball joint's not in too bad of shape. You can see a buildup of grease and grime here, so probably it's leaking some grease, but the boot itself seems in decent shape. Now I am replacing this because I recently replaced everything on the driver's side, so I'm doing things in pairs. So regardless of condition, I'm just replacing it anyways. The brake caliper pins, the slider pins, these are in rough shape, super cheap to replace. Might as well, they have to come out anyways. These will definitely cause a sticking caliper, which could have led to the gouged rotors and pads. The rotor itself could probably be turned. Honestly, not really worth the money for the cost nowadays. It's just easiest to replace the entire rotor. Also, there's no sense in putting gouged pads on a new rotor, so those are replaced. This is the original faulty component, the wheel bearing. Definitely in rough shape. Potentially the original, I can't confirm 100%. I think it is a SKF brand. I thought I saw a logo somewhere along the lines, but that is definitely in rough shape, and then that's the ABS sensor that fell off when I removed it. And lastly, this nightmare of a sway bar end link. These things sucked mainly because there's nowhere to hold on to a wrench on the back side of it, so as you try to knock off this nut, this stud just spins inside of here. So on the new ones, I'll show you, it has a beautiful hex head, so you can just put it in place, slide a wrench on the end of it, and then hit that with an impact. Everything locks down beautifully, and if you have to remove it, you will be able to, unlike the OEM one. So here's all the original components we'll be swapping out. Here is what I ended up doing off camera. Cleaned everything up. I hit the caliper with some Duplicolor ceramic paint. If you're looking for that, got this at my local auto parts store. You can definitely find it on the interwebs. I also decided to hit this aluminum knuckle with that exact same ceramic caliper paint. Had it laying on the shelf. Now, it's purely cosmetic, absolutely not required, but I think it tidies everything up. How I ended up painting this, I put the original wheel bearing in place, spray painted everything, then removed that wheel bearing, mainly because I didn't want a buildup of paint around the mating surfaces. The dust shield goes over top of here as well as the wheel bearing. You don't want a lot of paint buildup because that does affect how this mounts in here and can mess with the tolerances, potentially causing wheel bearing issues in the future, wobble, and so on and so forth. So will it make that big of a difference by just painting over top of that? Probably not, but it's definitely something I wanted to avoid. Also, talking about paint, if you remember in the other video, that subframe was very scaled up with rust, so I took some extra time. I used some POR 15 paint over rust paint, which sealed everything up. It was brush on. I'm not sure if they have a spray on version, but because this is my daily driver and it sees a lot of rock salt, brine, salt, other crap they put on the road that really rusts everything out, this is by far the best fighting chance, making sure it doesn't happen any worse than it already has been. Along with that, I took some extra time. I converted the 10mm studs that oftentimes break in this wheel liner that mounted into place, converted those to riv nuts. If you're interested in that conversion, click up top here. Now I did get a little happy with the rust sealer paint. I was hitting a bunch of seams in behind here and I didn't realize how this cut in, and well, unfortunately I ran a bit over and it looks kind of ridiculous, but I'll likely pick up some laser red spray paint and do something along those lines to cover that mess up. But quite honestly, with the wheel in here, you're not going to notice. Now, the most disappointing portion of this disassembly was things that I didn't really account for. First one being the turn signal or marker light up in the fender. When I was up close and personal changing all this stuff, I noticed there was moisture in this light. I examined a little bit further and the lens just fell off. So I'll either find a replacement or glue this lens back on. Seems like it's still in decent shape, but the biggest bummer is something that unfortunately I caused, and that is this large 4-inch section of missing paint. Well, this paint was rather soft here. It's getting a bunch of rock chips and it's still very delicate to the touch. So I wanted to seal it, preserve it. It wasn't going to get any better, but I didn't want it to get any worse. Well, unfortunately, while I was in this wheel well, I was coming out, my jacket caught it, and it ripped off a giant section. That is rather tragic. I could probably use some touch-up paint, and that same Pour 15 paint, they do offer it in a clear, so I could probably just touch it up, clear it. Will it be perfect? No. But, I mean, it'd be enough to get by. But as you can kind of see down here, it's starting to rust from the inside out. And really, this is very minimal compared to a lot of the 9.3s that I've seen in this area. I mean, there's usually big gaping holes in here. So this really isn't too terrible, but it's something whenever the rest of the car is in such nice shape, my eye is drawn specifically to that flaw. So I'll quit rambling. I have a slew of parts ready to go on the car. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, got the two 18mm bolts, the 18mm nuts. Make sure you have the washer on, and that actually goes closest to the head portion, but feed it up through the bottom. Here's the long 18mm bolt with the 18mm nut, again with the washer. Make sure you hand tighten everything. Get the two bolts in the rear of the control arm, this long bolt in the front before you hit it with an impact to cinch everything down. Two bolts on the rear here, this long bolt on the front of this A-arm or the control arm. All three get torqued down to 48 pound-feet plus 90 degrees. The bolt on the backside of this control arm in this bushing section right here, this should already be torqued down to spec, but double check that it's 30 pound-feet plus 30 degrees. Hit your wheel bearing. I'm going to use a bit of anti-seize here by Permatex, and I'll put it around the lip here just so in case if I ever have any issues with this, I'll be able to remove it relatively easily. Don't go crazy. Definitely don't do it on the threads. I'm simply just putting it around this lip where it rests inside this steering knuckle. Now we have the dust shield and the wheel bearing with some anti-seize on it. Fish the sensor wire through. And notice that there are multiple different hole orientations. You need to get this correct, otherwise it'll shift this over. And you can definitely mount this incorrectly like such. And what that does is it won't line up properly when you go to mount the caliper because the dust shield will kind of just be in the way. So we need to make sure the bolt holes are lined up where they need to be. And also this protruding section of the ABS wheel speed sensor, that needs faced towards the front. Fish this wire through, line up, make sure this sensor's towards the front. There's a bolt hole all the way at the top. Now that everything's lined up, we'll get the three E18 external Torx bolts through. Looking at the back side here, this is where the ABS sensor needs to be, and then notice how this hole lines up perfectly with the dust shield. So that gives us the correct spacing for the caliper when it's time to mount that. Now we just need to evenly tighten these down. Final torque specs, 66 pound-feet plus 45 degrees. And this is definitely something that you'll want to use Loctite on. This is the blue stuff. It is not the permanent. The permanent is red. Not to be confused with the red and blue on it, but look for the blue 242 for the non-permanent stuff. So plenty of space to get a couple drops of Loctite in here. Next part here is somewhat of an awkward balancing act. We need to simultaneously get the CV axle in here and also onto the stud of the ball joint. Now we need to take the E14 external Torx bolt and fish it through, but before we do such, here is the old ball joint, or the old controller with the ball joint, and notice how there is a groove in this. So this groove basically needs lined up to where that bolt slides through in here. Groove locks this ball joint into place. So fishing this through can kind of be a balancing act. It's going to take a bit of wiggling and some tapping with the hammer. Take the 16mm nut, thread it on the back side, and this gets torqued down to 37 pound-feet. I don't know about you, but for me, one of my least favorite things when working on a vehicle would be dealing with a McPherson strut assembly like the one you see here next to me that was pulled from my Saab 9.3. Now, replacing the unit in its entirety, most vehicles is not that terrible. It's just whenever you're on the extra frugal side of things like myself and you only want to replace, say, one component out of this entire unit, well, that's when things get sketchy rather quickly. To do such, I went to my local auto parts store and I got what's called a coil spring compressor tool, which consists of these two long bolts. One goes on each side of the coil spring. You tighten it down as evenly as possible. What that does is it compresses this coil spring, takes tension off this top mount so you're able to back out the nut up top here. For me, I'm going to swap on a new plate, undo that coil spring compressor, and we should be off to the races. Now, this unit is very rusty and crusty, and believe it or not, it performs better than it looks. But like I previously mentioned, this is only a temporary fix until I can save up the money for a nice set of Coney yellow strut assemblies. I have the coil spring compressor tool mounted up very loosely. I have it set up as parallel as possible. Not the most ideal section here to get at it with. It's just unfortunate there's no ring here to really get a longer throw of it, but quite honestly, we're not really compressing it too much, so I don't think this short travel is going to be too big of a deal. Now, the bottom of this strut assembly, keeping this in place, is held in with a vise, cinched down. Now this top cap, that just simply pops off like such, giving you access to the 21mm bolt at the top. Now, if you have an OEM unit, it may very well be a different size, so pay attention to that. You'll definitely want to use, say, an impact gun. That way you can blast this off quickly. Otherwise, if you're doing it by hand tools, you're actually going to just spin this shaft and you'll never be able to loosen that up. So definitely use something like an impact gun. And one last tip before we start this process, whenever you do this, definitely don't have your head hanging over this. God forbid something were to happen, this top to blow off. You don't want to blast your pretty face off. That's the nut. This should lift off like such. Here's the old versus the new. Shouldn't take much brain power, if any, to figure out what's the old one. That doesn't sound good. Plus, it shouldn't separate and be rusty like that. New one. All you can hear is the grease moving around inside, and it freely spins. It's a beautiful thing. Top mounts that come with it. Obviously, the old rusty and crusty. There's also a rubber bushing down in here. That could very well be bad as well. This one, you can kind of see the rubber in there, but nice and clean. But we'll take that bearing, we'll set it at the top, line everything up, take the washer, take the lock nut. I want to hand tighten this first, make sure I don't cross thread it. Back off the two 18mm bolts here. That'll create tension on this top mount again, and then we will fully tighten this top nut. Top bolts take a 13mm socket and get torqued down to 14 pound-feet. So your replacement bolt, you want it to go this direction with the 18mm nut on the front side. You may have different variations of this specific bolt. This one is an original equipment bolt. There's no adjustments on it, so the end right here with the 15mm head, it doesn't really make a difference what orientation you have it. Mine were facing up and down, so that's exactly how I will replace it. There are specific cam bolts to adjust your camber that have an oblong section here, and you replace both of these, and what that does is it, dependent on the orientation, it adjusts your wheel in or out to adjust the camber. So this one is the original. I'll just fish it through and make sure the nut is on the front side. $18mm socket. These get torqued down to 59 pound-feet plus 135 degrees. This is the sway bar end link replacement that I'll be using. It's by Moog. Like all the parts in this particular video, they will all be listed in the description below. Now this one, my favorite part, you can put an 18mm wrench on the stud. That way whenever you go to tighten or loosen it, you're not stuck with a spinning link here, which forces you to cut it off like the original one. So one point I mentioned is these Zerk fittings to grease this, it can switch depending on what orientation you have it. For me, I'm going to do it this way. It will be hidden behind the strut assembly, but it's still going to be easy to access to grease. And that way I can grease this lower one by the sway bar end link easier. Now, if I had it flipped, this Zerk fitting would be too close to the CV axle and I'd never be able to get a grease gun in there. Bad idea to hit this with some extra grease. Next up, we'll do the ABS sensor here. I'm using a bit of dielectric grease just to make sure moisture doesn't get inside this connection, corrode it, and cause any ABS issues. Got the metal tab, the little tang facing inwards, and just tap it with a hammer. Next up is the rotor. So I already have this brake cleaned, and I'll go over it one more time when I put the caliper on, but a point to mention is I don't have a replacement set screw. I had to drill out the original one, and it was just going to take too long to get a replacement to do this video, and quite honestly, it's not going to be too big of a deal because what actually holds this on is going to be all the lug nuts. So temporarily, I have a lug put into here, so this isn't going to move. It'll make the installation of the caliper that much easier. Using the appropriate blue Loctite on these big E20E Torx bolts for the caliper brackets. I totally forgot that whenever I disassembled and removed this bracket bolt, I had to take out this lower strut bolt. So order of operations, definitely wait to tighten this strut bolt until after you finish tightening this top bracket bolt. Now torque specs, 155 pound-feet plus 30 degrees. Point I mentioned here before I mount this caliper, if you notice this ABS sensor, the cable it runs along connects into this lower strut bracket, runs across here. I have the cable kind of arcing, and then what I ended up doing was taking two zip ties, wrapping it around the steering knuckle and this connector for the ABS system. The slack I have running down here, there's a good spot to route it all the way down here, which then therefore leads to the CV axle and the wheel bearing and everything down there. So what I was having a problem with, I didn't like that there was too much slack on this cable. The CV axle, if you notice there's a clamp here, this portion protrudes out. While it's just spinning at high speeds, it could have easily caught any slack here ripping this cable and rendering this new bearing and ABS sensor useless. So I imagine there's probably a clip of some sort that would have connected this ABS connector to this strut bracket, but you know, somebody has been in here before and that's broken. I just didn't like the slack, but I think this is a good alternative from preventing issues with that clamp tearing this new cable. Got the pads ready to go in place. Note how this one has a small rectangle at the bottom. This one does not. This one is the one that is going on the outside. This one without that little notch in the bottom goes on the inside. Now I'm going to take the silicone brake grease, looks like tar, and I'm just going to put a little bit on the back side. This really isn't required by any means, but sometimes this helps quiet things up, keeps the chatter down, because this is where the piston rides along. And at a minimum, you definitely want to put brake grease on these ears, because that is what is the point of motion. Now here is this outer pad. Again, I'm putting the brake grease on the contact point, so this right here will make contact right there. That just kind of helps reduce the chances of getting any brake chatter. And again, put it on these ears. We have the two brand new slider pins with the 7mm hex that'll tighten them. Now, you don't need Loctite on the new ones because that's what on the end. But what you do need to do is take your brake grease and make sure all of this is covered, minus the threads. Make sure you put on your 2 rubber caps to prevent road grime from getting in here. We're officially on the home stretch. I have the repainted brake caliper clip here. Now, just like the disassembly process of this specific clip, I really honestly don't know what I am doing, but I presume we'll get one ear down here. I know how it goes. It's just, I don't know the best method for actually getting it on because already I'm scratching this. Wonder maybe combination with the trim removal tool. Okay, maybe tap it. Woo, look at that. All right, so, well, kind of scratched it up a little bit, dirtied things up, give it a little quick touch of paint, be good to go. Okay, since I need the ring as a spacer for my aftermarket wheels, I'm actually going to put a bit of anti-seize on this hub. Definitely not required. But that way this doesn't get all rusted up. Wipe off majority of it. We'll leave just enough to where we won't get that scaling, and in the future we will be able to easily remove this little ring. Next up is this big old 1.25 inch nut. Now, it is recommended that you'll want to replace this, and unfortunately I have to reuse this old one temporarily. I do have a new one on order, so it's a real simple process to jack the vehicle up and pull the wheel off to replace this. It's the 1.25 inch, and then it's 170 pound-feet. Now, if you're questioning if I'm just telling you torque specs and just kind of hand cinching it down, well, no, off camera I am actually torquing this stuff to spec. Give this a good spin, make sure we don't hear any funny noises, nothing's binding. Everything sounds good to go. We'll go in the vehicle, we'll pump the brakes, make sure everything goes back appropriately. That way, whenever you lower the vehicle and you drive it out of your garage, you don't risk an issue of having a soft pedal. And then we'll actually hit this with one last go of brake clean and throw the wheel on. Woo-wee, would you look at that? Just look at that. So if you can't tell, I am super jazzed after this long, drawn-out repair, and that it's back under its own weight on its wheels. Unfortunately, there's one last piece of the puzzle that I cannot show you how to do, and that is the simple fact that you need to get the car aligned. Because all this stuff was disturbed, even if you think you put it back as close to the original as possible, you're going to have a slight variation. And if you're like myself where you did both sides, you really risk the car not tracking down the road straight. At a minimum, take the time to get the car aligned, spend the money, it's well worth the investment so you don't risk premature wear of your expensive tires. That is officially a wrap on the disassembly and reinstallation of all those front end parts on my daily 9.3. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop a comment down below. I'd actually be curious to know what a shop would quote to do all of those front end parts on a Saab. I think that'd be pretty interesting. But if this video helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Definitely consider subscribing. Looking at my video analytics, 90% of people watch my videos but don't subscribe. So that's stuff I love to see, the likes, the subscriptions. That keeps me going, doing what I love to do. And of course, consider subscribing because I have a ton of how-to stuff out there, but also more to come here in the near future. Like I previously mentioned, I'll be installing a new fender here. I just need to pick it up. The power fold mirrors from a previous video, those are working beautifully. However, I never finalized the auto dim portion of those. I just wanted to complete some serious maintenance stuff first before I dived into that. And lastly, I have some Go Fast goodies from DO88 coming up here hopefully shortly, so consider subscribing for that. With that being said, I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you friends next time.